Afternoon. Thank you, Lupe, for that introduction, and thank you all for the time and the interest in participating in this event today. I want to start out by thanking Mindy and Astrid, both with the Future of California Elections and the California Civic Engagement Project, for their effort to collaborate, to provide this opportunity to have this discussion and the panels today, in spite of the uncertain conditions that we're all experiencing. I will share with you that they both reached out to me quite literally the week after the election to begin talking about how we could have this dialogue, and I think it's such an important opportunity. So I want to thank them for that. Thank all of you. I know there are many of you who partnered with us leading into the March election and the implementation of the Voting Solutions for All People project in Los Angeles County. I know on an individual and probably on a broader basis that you have had questions and concerns about some of what happened in March, and since then, what's going to happen leading into November, because obviously things, a lot happened on March 3rd, but a lot happened that week after, and things changed dramatically. And so that has limited our ability to have direct dialogue with many of you. So I've looked forward to this opportunity. And while it still may be limited today, I hope that this kicks off a continuing conversation and partnership with all of you as we lead into November. So let me open up a slide presentation. Just real quickly, let me just start by reviewing kind of where we've come from and where we are in LA County. I think everybody probably is familiar with the fact that we launched a new voting experience in Los Angeles County in March based on the Voting Solutions for All People initiative, which has been a decade-long effort to reimagine not just the technology and systems that are used to conduct elections in California, or I'm sorry, in Los Angeles, but also to look at this through the lens of the voter and to create a new voting experience. As we went through that process and that project, it evolved, the regulatory environment changed as well. So our prior system, which was at the end of its life cycle, also became decertified based on the security concerns over the last decade around voting systems and the need for modernization in general of voting systems, and the changes in California state law and the need for our systems and infrastructure in Los Angeles County to accommodate the policy changes that had taken place in California. So compliance with the VoteCal statewide database, changes in allowing for the vote center environment, the conditional voter registration laws, those types of things that were not particularly compatible or conducive in our prior system. So just a quick overview. LA County did adopt the Voters' Choice Act model in March. We did that based on a particular formula that was adopted in the law for Los Angeles County. So we were a little bit of a hybrid compared to the other VCA counties in California, but some of the main components were still in place. So we did have 10 days of voting before Election Day at vote centers where voters in the county could go to any voting location to cast their ballot. We did expand vote by mail in LA County. We mailed ballots to approximately 63% of the voters in Los Angeles County. And then at the vote centers, we launched the use of our new ballot marking devices, accessible voting technology, and the e-poll books, which are the tools that enable us to have the vote centers where people can vote at any location, but also meets important needs for Los Angeles County voters, such as language assistance, accessibility, and the conditional voter registration. So that's just a little bit of background. I know that's familiar to everybody here. So what did we learn? Obviously, as I mentioned, and want to be real up front, we know that there were issues and there were problems with the rollout of this model in the March election. And we have good data to show that, and that's data we didn't have before. So it actually gives us a broad spectrum of information that we can use to ensure that those issues don't reoccur and to fine-tune the process going forward. So let me just share a little bit of that data. And this is data that's included in a report back that we did to the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors that can be made available to anyone who has interest. But here's some of what we learned in the process. We had nearly 1 million voters cast a vote at a vote center during the March election in Los Angeles County, but only 27% of those voters voted during that 10-day early voting period, which was lower than what we had projected or anticipated. So we had 73% of our in-person voters go to vote centers on election day itself. So that led to capacity issues depending on the size of the vote center that we definitely need to look at addressing. We had about 1.4 million, or I'm sorry, 1.14 million of our voters who cast ballots in the election through our vote by mail process. Interestingly enough, to kind of flip back to the earlier part, of those 73% who voted on election day, 450,000 of those were voters who also had been mailed a vote by mail ballot. So that's interesting data to look at. We've sort of tried to dissect that from a number of spectrums, and of course things are going to be different in November given the public health situation that we're dealing with going forward. I think some of that had to do with the fact that this was a presidential primary and the dynamics of the candidates were changing leading up to election day, but it's certainly an indication to us, and I know to many people who are participating today, that even as we expand vote by mail and look to vote by mail as that fail-safe method for conducting an election in a pandemic environment, or hopefully a post-pandemic environment, the need in LA County for robust and accessible in-person voting experiences is still a primary concern, and something that we need to ensure that we provide that going forward. And I'll get into that in a little bit later. We did do a post-election survey on our own. We sent an email survey to about 27,000 voters who participated in the election. On the positive side, 70% of the respondents to that survey indicated that they did have a positive voting experience in Los Angeles County. Unfortunately, 20% indicated that they had a negative voting experience in LA County. That's probably the more important number for us, because we need to focus on that. Obviously not an acceptable number, and raises concerns. A subset of that, 15% of the people who were surveyed indicated that they experienced excessive waiting times voting, and that was particularly, obviously, the voters who went to vote in person. In addition to that, Loyola Marymount conducted an exit poll survey, really good data there, with some really granular information from voters about their voting experience that will help us in improving. And then the Board of Supervisors in Los Angeles County, through a motion the week after the election, took two steps that were important to demonstrating the county's commitment to addressing these issues going forward. One of those things was to have the department under my direction to prepare a post-election report that got into specific issues, and I'll summarize some of those in this presentation. But in addition to that, we have worked, the county has worked with an independent third-party organization to look at our report and to validate our recommendations, but also to offer any additional recommendations that they may have. So there is some independence and oversight of that and of the data, and that process has been going constantly since right after the election. So we have a lot of good information and a lot of good direction. I think that the good news is all of that seems to be aligning. I think that the direction is clear, the needs and the issues that need to be addressed are clear, and there is a path forward in that regard. So what are those post-election key findings? So in our report to the board, we identified 47 specific actions or changes that needed to take place looking ahead to the November election. I should add that another part of the board's motion was in addition to the retroactive look at the March election, there was also a mandate to look forward at that time to the November election and to present a feasibility study for expanding to the full Voters' Choice Act model under California law, which includes mailing a ballot to every registered voter in Los Angeles County. That was a week or so ahead of when things started to change under the pandemic, so we had a little bit of a head start on that, and that led to the adoption of our board on April 28th of that model. So we do know for sure, and again, I'll talk more about this in a minute, that LA County will be mailing a ballot to every registered voter in the November election and in all subsequent elections going forward in LA County. So I'm going to cover 7 kind of key areas. I think they're the ones that are probably most relevant and most familiar. There's a lot of sub-issues in these, but for purposes of this presentation, I think these are really the most important ones. First and foremost, we know that there were excessive wait times on March 3rd, and those issues were related to technical issues with the systems that we had in place. Primarily those issues related to the electronic poll books that were used to check in voters. There were other issues associated with the size and capacity of the vote centers that we had secured for the election. Again, related to the poll pads, there was a usability feature for the election workers that they used to do the check-in of voters that was not streamlined and was not functioning the way it was intended to function. And then the impacts of conditional voter registration had a direct impact on excessive wait times as well, because those transactions took longer to process. On the solution side, a number of steps we're taking. We are working directly with the manufacturer and the vendor that provides the electronic poll books, known as the poll pad, to modify their software to speed up the synchronization process that allows us to have near real-time updates. That's what provides the security of allowing a voter to go to any vote center, but also to ensure that people are only voting once in the election. We learned a lot in that process and in our post-election analysis on ways to streamline that process. We're also going to make sure that there's a minimum of 5 poll pads that are deployed and connected and up and operating at all times. One of the things that we learned in the process in March is that in the early days of voting, where the volume was lower, sometimes those devices weren't turned on. And if they weren't turned on each day, then when they were powered up, it took longer to synchronize the data from the prior days of the election. So we want to be sure that those are all across the board, are all being synchronized on the same schedule. We're adding new search filters that will allow the check-in process to go more quickly and make it easier for voters to check in. And then we'll be doing additional training for our election workers to streamline conditional voter registration, but also to encourage voters to take advantage of tools such as using the barcode that's on their sample ballot to automatically check in at the vote center. So those are just a handful of issues that we're doing to address wait times. What's not listed here on this screen, but I want to emphasize, is we're also working with a number of different partners, including Caltech, on ways to measure wait times and to make that available to voters on a real-time basis. So a voter deciding to go to a vote center would actually have access to some data to indicate what the projected wait time or volume of people who might be at that particular vote center, and also to identify which vote centers have fewer people or a shorter wait period. Staffing at vote centers is another issue that we looked at very closely. We because of the compression leading into the election, our systems were not on par with what they needed to be for effectively managing the data, making sure that we had adequate staffing levels at vote centers, tracking who actually showed up to be at the vote centers, whether they had been trained, a number of just different logistical issues around that. That was also impacted by a delay in the finalizing and securing all of the vote centers for the election, and the size and allocation of those vote centers led to some places where we had understaffing and other places where we had overstaffing. So we need to be able to balance that, do load balancing on that, and make sure that we have a better tracking system for that. There were also some delays in getting information out to those election workers, and those are all being addressed through implementation of a new data management tool that is built and customized around election worker assignments and the model of vote centers that we're deploying in Los Angeles County. We're starting the vote center and election worker recruitment processes much earlier going into November. At the same time, though, we recognize that has probably become even more challenging given the pandemic conditions, where it will be more challenging to get agreement for facilities to open their doors for us to have a vote center, as well as election workers who may be a little more hesitant to work over a period of time given the pandemic conditions. So it's going to be important that we get a jump start on that, and that we develop more innovative programs to look at how we staff them and how we build those partnerships to get the vote centers. And we're in the process of doing those things right now. Election worker training, obviously a priority issue always in elections administration, and that certainly was the case here. We dealt with issues in March where the content of the training was changing on a real-time basis as we were leading up to the election, given the volume of people that needed to be trained, and the fact that some things were still developing in the procedures and even in legislation regarding how to handle conditional voter registration transactions leading up to literally the week before the election. And as a result of that, we had election workers who were recruited late in the process, maybe had not had complete training, and were not well versed on the use of the poll pad that led to some of the issues that we talked about. And as I mentioned, the conditional voter registration processes were not particularly well understood because we had some people who had been trained early in the process, but then the legislation changed leading up to the election, so there was some conflict and miscommunication around that. So streamlining those processes, finalizing the training on an earlier basis, building in some more robust analysis and evaluation of those trainings so we have a better handle on how well the procedures were comprehended, offering more hands-on training, in particular on the poll pads and the check-in process, and looking at what's the appropriate length and duration of that training and how can we augment that through our online election worker training program as well. Vote center setup and deployment. This relates back to my prior comments about the delay in securing the vote centers, which had a direct effect. But we also learned through this process that given the size and complexity of Los Angeles County, our internal staff within the county, even with the assistance of many other county departments, really doesn't have the skill set or the capacity to do the deployment and setup of those vote centers given the time frame that is required. We built that system or we modeled that system around an assumption that we would have access to these vote center locations well in advance of the first day of voting and for an extended period of time after Election Day to do setup, deployment, and also breakdown. The reality is that the types of places that are best positioned to serve as functional vote centers with the capacity that we need on Election Day are obviously locations where those facilities are in high demand. And so it's very difficult to negotiate that lead time and that time after the election. So to compensate for that, we are going to contract out or outsource the deployment and setup of the vote centers. That will allow a higher capacity to do that in a shorter period of time before Election Day, and to break that down and get the equipment out of those locations after Election Day much faster than we were able to do in the primary. And that will also free up our staff to do the operations and to build the capacity for those things where we do have the critical skill sets and knowledge to support the election. Help desk call center for election workers and voters. This is another area where essentially a capacity issue, that a combination of a capacity issue and technology. We had a number of different call centers and help desks that were deployed or employed during the election, but they were disparate. So calls could come into any number of those places, and the nature of the call may not get to the subject matter expert that could help address that. So we're going to consolidate those so that the voter-facing call centers are all going into one system and tracked on a more streamlined basis. The calls coming in from election workers will go to a direct location, and then for our technical support, we're going to, again, outsource that to a third party that will not do the technical support, but that will log those calls and handle the dispatch of the field tech supports that will be out in the community and able to more quickly address the issues at the vote centers. We're also going to expand the number of field tech supports to at least a ratio of 1 tech support to every 2 vote centers, possibly even 1 to 1. We're doing an analysis of that right now. Ballot marking devices. This is one that we heard quite a bit about on election day and post-election day. The data shows that while there were issues with a number of ballot marking devices, most of those issues related to an identified faulty printer gear that occurred in a subset of the manufacturing process. So it didn't affect all units. It affected units that were manufactured on a particular thread or a number of days. That's been addressed. That's been corrected, and we also are adding a new firmware to the devices that prevents or greatly decreases the likelihood of ballot jams on the entrance point when the voter first puts their blank ballot into the device. That is in testing and certification now, and we'll go through volume testing. So we have a high level of confidence that addresses that issue. But beyond that issue, the ballot marking devices, based on the data that we got back from voters and actually looking at the logs, actually performed fairly effectively at the vote centers, and voters indicated that once they were able to get to the ballot marking device and utilize it to mark their ballot, that they were very comfortable and pleased with the features of those devices. So a lot of that, I think, has to do with again getting things right on the front end. There was certainly a perception issue. You saw in the news rooms full of these devices where they were sitting idle, and a lot of that related back to the backlog that we had in the check-in process, and that of course will be addressed going forward. One of the things we'll have to look at now in the COVID-19 environment is recruiting vote centers that have a larger footprint so that we can provide more physical distancing between the devices and ensure that that we maintain the guidance from public health in that process as well. So in addition to analyzing and thinking about what are the right number of vote centers to have during the 10-day voting period and the 4-day voting period, is also the characteristics of those vote centers. What is the size, the capacity, and the geography of where those are deployed? So all of that is part of our current project plan. Final one I'll mention, and I think this was more of a transition or change in voting culture. There were issues raised about confusion from voters who did not understand that when you vote on the ballot marking device that you complete that voting process on the device, and that the voted ballot actually goes back into the secure ballot box that's attached to that device, rather than taking it back to a communal ballot box, which is what voters were accustomed to under the prior system. We are looking at a number of different ways to increase the visibility and the awareness of that process so that voters aren't confused by that, but also to emphasize the security and the usability features that are associated with having that ballot box on the ballot marking device. And that again relates back to the accessibility and privacy issues, and that was designed that way intentionally. So what we need to work on is the messaging, both when the voter goes through the check-in process, so they're oriented to that, but also the on-screen messaging to let them know what happens next in the process, and to help them work through that. So that's a summary, very high-level summary. Again, just a snapshot of over 47 specific actions or recommendations that we identified in our process, and we didn't do that in a vacuum. We did that with a lot of engagement with voters, election workers who worked in March, our stakeholder community, and again a third-party validation of those recommendations, and that work is well underway as we move forward. So on top of that, as I mentioned at the beginning, the other thing that has changed since then is that we presented to the Board of Supervisors an implementation plan and a feasibility study of expanding vote by mail for the November general election, so that every voter in LA County will receive a vote by mail ballot. Again, the Board of Supervisors adopted that plan on April 28th, a week before the governor's executive order. So we had a little bit of a head start on that, and we are moving forward with that implementation plan as well. But again, recognizing, and this is an area where we're still doing analysis and still looking for direction, and ultimately will will arrive at what is the minimum threshold and ratio for the number of vote centers for LA County. We know that that's a dialogue that's going on statewide. We know there's been some work coming out of the Secretary of State's working group on that. We know that there's a dialogue going on in Sacramento in the legislature about that minimum. I think it's clear to us in LA County that the minimum is not going to be an acceptable number in Los Angeles County. What we deployed in March was well above the minimum that we were required to have in March, and we still had issues. So again, that's more than just the numbers game. It's also the types of locations and the way in which we engage and educate the public about that. But I think it's, again, important. There's been some confusion in some meetings I've gone to, and even in media reports that indicate that the move to mail everybody a ballot in Los Angeles County will mean a drastic reduction in in-person voting options. We do not anticipate that. We think there will be a shift, but there will still be significant options for voters to vote in person in LA County for those voters who need or desire to do that. Again, recognizing that we have to do that in alignment with public health guidelines. The good news is we've had an opportunity to do that on a smaller scale. We had municipal elections in 2 cities in April. We had the congressional district special election in the 25th congressional district just last week. In both of those elections, we did offer voting experiences at mobile and pop-up vote centers that were in those cases, external facilities where we were able to allow for social distancing, to take the appropriate steps to make sure that that we provided access and opportunity for voters to vote in person, but that we also protected the safety of our election workers and voters alike in that process. So this is just a quick snapshot of what that is going to look like in the November election. Again, we'll be mailing ballots to every registered voter. That's an increase of 2.5 million, projected increase of about 2.5 million vote-by-mail ballots above what we issued in the March election. So to put that into perspective, in Los Angeles County, that's the equivalent of layering on the full electorate of a San Diego County or an Orange County on top of the 63% that we already had mailed ballots to in March. So that's a significant undertaking. It will be the largest. We already were the largest vote-by-mail operation in the country in a single jurisdiction, and now we're increasing that substantially. So we're working very closely with vendors, our providers. We're literally looking for additional space so that we can do that in a very open and transparent way. I think we're all aware of the dialogue nationally around vote by mail and dealing with the misinformation or lack of information that is out there. We're going to need to combat that and ensure that our voters are comfortable with the processes that take place, and that we give them the confidence that vote by mail ballot is the fail-safe method to ensure that even in a condition such as a pandemic, that every voter in LA County will have the opportunity to vote. Some of that includes, given our electorate, doing some early outreach to voters, so that if voters want to request that ballot come to them in a language other than English. We have 13 required languages in Los Angeles. We want to be sure that we get that information out and we give them the opportunity to apply for that early on, so it's not a matter of them getting the ballot in English and then having to go through a process of requesting a replacement ballot. So we'll be doing a lot of work around that in the early months of the summer, including mirroring that with a list maintenance process to ensure that we have good addresses for every voter that are recognized by the Postal Service, those types of critical pieces that are associated with vote by mail. At the vote centers, we will be designing this around a safe in-person vote center that allows us to comply with whatever the state and county guidelines are from public health officials at the time of the November election. We do still plan at this point to offer voting beginning 10 days before the election, and then to expand that during the final 4 days of the election under the model of the VCA. We recognize there may be some modification to that by executive order or by legislation, and again, we'll continue to work through that, but at this stage we are planning based on the VCA model. We will also be expanding the number of vote by mail drop boxes that are available in the county, and in particular emphasizing the permanent 24-hour, 7-day-a-week boxes that are available out in the community, so voters don't have to go into a building or into a place where other people are gathered in order to drop off their vote by mail ballot. A couple of things just to re-emphasize the steps that we're taking in terms of the public health conditions, and these are things that, again, we did during the April and May elections. We'll do again in the June 2nd special election coming up. We are requiring that voters, based on the public health order, wear a clean face covering when they visit a vote center. We do provide disposable face coverings, supply of those at the vote center, so if people do arrive and they don't have a face covering, we can provide that if needed. All of our election workers will be wearing personal protective equipment, gloves, and face coverings. We will be enforcing social distancing, so we actually mark off the space using cones and tape to ensure that we maintain that social distancing. And all of our equipment is sanitized after each voter transaction. So that's the ballot marking devices, but it's also the check-in equipment, the stylus that's used, and we also provide, if somebody requests to use gloves in the process of marking their ballot, we will have a supply of those as well. This is an area where we recognize there's ongoing development with the public health orders, and there's ongoing guidance coming across the country from people who are looking at how best to offer voting in a safe and secure manner under these conditions. So we will be agile and adaptable to additional guidance in this respect as well. So what does this look like timeline? I wish that we could say that we had a longer on-ramp to the election than we had in March, but given the significant change that now we're layering on top of the change that we already undertook in March, this is still a very aggressive and constrained time frame. We need to be ready by September 24th to mail sample ballots to all of our voters, and our goal is to have vote centers secured and scheduled at that time so that information can be included in the sample ballots. By October 5th, all of those vote by mail ballots need to go in the mail to all of our voters, and that means that we also need to have our vote by mail drop boxes open and ready to take voted ballots. And that will also represent the first day that early voting is available in person, at least at our headquarters facility. And then the official voter registration deadline is October 19th. We know with conditional voter registration that people can continue to register or change their registration after that date. But in a vote by mail environment, that will represent the cutoff by which somebody registers or changes their registration and gets a vote by mail ballot under the vote by mail model. After that, any change or new registration will need to take place at a vote center. The 10-day vote centers would open on October 24th, and then we would open the remaining locations during that final 4 days leading up to Election Day, where of course they would be open during traditional polling hours from 7 a.m. To 8 p.m. Embedded in all of this, there is no question that the success of this depends on a functional and effective media and outreach education campaign. That was part of our post-election analysis. While we did have a high-profile media and outreach campaign heading into the March election, it is also clear that this is a topic that, at least in the March environment, it was hard to really capture the attention of voters until they were ready to go cast their ballots. So that may look a little different heading into a presidential general election, but we don't want to hedge our bets on that. We want to work with media partners to ensure that we have the right messaging, that it is targeted to particular communities. So whatever the effective venue or medium of outreach and education for a particular community or a particular population is represented in that broader campaign plan that we're looking at. So that will include everything ranging from direct mailings to all registered voters in the county, to email and social media campaigns, television, radio, digital advertising, neighborhood, neighbor to neighbor type of communications, and and significant investment in working with our multilingual, community-based media partners here in Los Angeles County. But we know we can't do that alone. Even with significant resources made available, which of course the competition is even higher for those resources given the economic impacts of the pandemic. We know that the partnerships with community organizations, CBOs, and even the campaigns and candidates who are involved in this election are going to be critical parts of that as well. And we will be stepping up our partnership activities and ensuring that we share information in a way that it can and be moved well beyond just the reach of our office. So with that, I will stop. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Again, I just want to thank everyone for their interest. I know that these are uncertain times, that everything changed right after the March election. I want you to know that the team here in Los Angeles County has been heads down, looking very closely at what happened in March, the things that didn't go well, but also really looking at those parts of the process that did go well, so that we can expand on those things. And so I will just mention in closing that one of the things that was a little bit under the radar in March, but that I think was particularly effective and is going to be very important in this COVID-19 environment heading into November, is our mobile and what we call flex vote centers, where during that 10-day early voting period, in addition to our fixed vote centers, we had mobile units and what we call pop-up locations that we took out into the community, where we knew that there were populations that were harder to serve, or that would have more difficulty accessing the fixed locations. That really proved to be a very successful model, and one that was embraced by voters. And I know we have our partners from AltaMed who are on a panel later today. They were particularly pivotal in the success of that, what I would call a pilot project in the March election. So we are going to expand on that, recognizing that with the pandemic conditions, people are going to be hesitant about where they go and what type of large size gatherings might be happening in the community. So we want to look at things like, if people are going for other public services to a particular physical location, if we can co-locate a mobile vote center at that location, so that when they're already going out to get services that they need and their communities in need, that they also will have the opportunity to take advantage of going in and casting their ballots at that time as well. So we're excited about expanding that. We think it's going to be an important component to the kind of the safe and secure element of the November election and moving forward. So again, thank you all, and I'm look forward to taking your questions. If we don't get to all of them today, I'll work closely with Astrid and Mindy to get a full listing of those. And if we can provide additional feedback, we're happy to do that.
Great, and thanks, Dean. We do have a lot of questions, and thank you so much for your presentation. And we asked a lot of Dean today. We asked him to cover March, and then to also share with us what's going to be happening and what are the voting options for November. And so wanted to thank you, Dean, for getting through all of that. We do have a lot of questions, and we will certainly follow up to the ones we don't get to answer. So let me jump in. Hello, everyone. My name is Astrid Ochoa. I'm the Executive Director of Future of California Elections, and thank you for joining us today. So I have lots of questions, so I grouped a couple of them. And so some of the questions here are around recruiting election workers, recognizing that our traditional election workers are in the at-risk category. How do we, what strategies are you using to implement and recruit election workers for this fall?
Yeah, great question, and one that's very much on our mind. Of course, looking at the demographics of our traditional election workers coming from, there are different categories of election workers. So we primarily have three broad categories of people who have served us as election workers in LA County. We have our community poll worker model. So that's sort of the traditional model that is best known throughout the state and throughout the country for working at polls. But we also have a very robust agreement within county government, where county employees are deployed to work as election workers. And we also have a fairly effective student poll worker program that we want to expand on. So we're looking at all three of those things. I think you're right, Astrid, and in the question that in the community election worker category, the demographics of that, especially when we're looking for people who are going to work for multiple days, tends to skew towards the more vulnerable population under the public health orders, and we're going to have to address that to the best of our ability. So I think the way we do that is through partnerships, looking creatively at not just the same tried and true recruitment methods of cold calling or taking referrals, but actually partnering with organizations and looking at models where a particular organization, maybe it's a CBO, maybe it's we had a past example where law students from LMU did this. They actually take responsibility and become ambassadors for a particular vote center site and provide the staffing for that. We're going to be looking closely and watching what happens with our higher education and our school systems. If our universities and colleges and community colleges are still in an online learning environment in the fall, that may be an opportunity for us to capitalize on some unique partnerships to get some of those students to come out and to participate in this process. There's also discussion. The California Association of Clerks and Election Officials is encouraging the legislature to look at closing public schools and public universities and colleges during that final 4 days, that Friday before the election through Tuesday, and to encourage those public employees to become partners in working at election centers or voting centers in California. So we're at the table in those discussions as well.
Great, and to your point, Dean, you were sharing the importance of partnerships, and there are many partners in LA County. What are some ways that you are using to connect and hear from voters, from former poll workers? I know I've talked to your staff of some of the outreach and survey work that you have done. Can you go ahead and let us know kind of how you're connecting with folks to get that input and to identify those partnerships?
Sure. I mean, it's very important to do that, and it's been challenging to do that because of the Safer at Home initiative. So initially, what we've done is, and you heard in my presentation, some very high-level statistics from our survey of voters. We did similarly. We did surveys of election workers, so the people who worked as leads at vote centers, as well as the broader spectrum of election workers. So we have that data. We're compiling that. And there's a lot of good information in that. That's not enough. We know that we're going to have to continue to look at, really dig into the data. For instance, we'll be looking at things like where were the voters who voted in person likely to go? Did they go to the place closest to their home, or did they go further away from home? And what can we discern from that? And how can we get more information about that? Which were the types of vote centers that became log jammed because they were physically smaller, but they obviously were more appealing to a larger group of population? I think that's something we're looking closely at. Where did voters experience discomfort with the type of vote center? And so looking at areas, again, where even in a vote by mail environment where we're mailing everybody a vote by mail ballot, we know that there are areas of Los Angeles County, geographic communities as well as demographic communities, where there is a trust gap with the Postal Service, and there's a trust gap with the confidence in voting by mail. And so we need to analyze that and be sure that we have even more robust in-person services in those areas, so that we compensate for that trust gap and try to bridge that. So. That's done through data analysis, but it's also going to be, again, don't want to overuse the word, but it's so true, through partnerships of getting into those neighborhoods and communities and talking to the people who are working on a day-to-day basis in those communities, who can give us guidance on how best we can address those gaps and ensure that we meet those needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now you made some references to voter behavior and where and when people choose to vote. And we know that when any jurisdiction has transitioned to a vote center model, the voting behavior shows, as you indicated in your presentation, that most people still show up on election day. So what are strategies that you all are considering to encourage either early voting or strategies to accommodate the fact that we know that people still show up on election day?
Yeah, I think all of the above on that. I think we have to look at all of those things. As I mentioned, I think some of the dynamics will be different in November than they were in March. Because there is at least some level of increased knowledge now about the early voting process. We won't have the dynamic of the late changes in the candidate pool leading up to Election Day. And we now have this environment where at least a certain segment of our population, I think, are going to embrace that that spreading of the curve, right? So they're not going to want to wait and go at a time where they think there are going to be lots and lots of people. But I don't think we can count on that. I think what we know, even from these smaller special elections that have taken place here in LA County as well as in other counties in the state, we know that from a campaign perspective, as you get closer to Election Day, the campaigns are going to continue to adapt their outreach campaigns, and literally on Election Day, I expect that the campaigns are going to, based on their data, their polling, are going to be driving people to get out and vote in those in-person voting locations. So we have to build the capacity for that. We have to have an environment that's scalable to that. And so some of that are the things I talked about earlier about how we measure wait times, the size and capacity of the vote centers being as important, if not more important, than the actual number of vote centers. And that needs to be part of our voter outreach and education campaign. We need to be more direct and more emphatic about informing voters that we're open and letting them know what percentage of voters have already participated, how many people have already returned a ballot by mail, how many people have voted in person, and what does that look like as you ramp up to Election Day? What does that mean if you're waiting and you're in that pool of people who haven't yet participated? What is that going to mean for you, and how can you anticipate and plan for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you started to go into it a bit in your presentation, but really, could you expand a bit about what it would look like to vote in person in November? What are going to be the PPE requirements, the personal protection equipment for election workers and for people coming in? We got a couple of questions there that people really would like to kind of understand what that might look like for November.
Yes, so the model that we have employed in these special elections, and we have worked directly with the guidance of our Department of Public Health on this. So we're trying to make sure that the steps we take are both in alignment with the public health guidelines, but also recognize just the perceptions and the personal comfort level, or to try and ramp down the anxiety of voters who might be in these locations. So a lot of it is the same thing that we're all dealing with, right? The same tips that we're hearing, and that is encouraging and making sure that people are wearing face coverings, making sure that we provide for the physical distancing, so that if there is a line, even if it's just a handful of people, that we're spacing those people out, and that the voting equipment is laid out in a manner that provides for that social distancing as well. Perhaps most important is demonstrating the cleanliness of the environment, the fact that we're disinfecting the devices after each use, that every hour throughout the day we are doing a full cleaning of the check-in environment, and posting that so people can see that that's not just something we talk about, but that there's a checklist so people can see that that's happened, and they can have the confidence that has occurred. I think that the challenge again that we're going to continue to face is what are the best locations that will facilitate those kind of provisions. So we're going to be, we've had the advantage in these smaller elections of being able to primarily use external locations where we had our mobile units, and literally we were in large parking lots, and so there was open air environment, so people could be well spaced out. That's the type of thing that we're going to have to look at closely. If we're looking at some range of 500 to 700 in-person vote centers, obviously some of those are going to be in facilities where people have to, go through corridors, or have to, go in multiple rooms, and that's where we're gonna have to look for those larger capacity facilities. That's a place where we hope that we can take advantage of the fact, at least for November, that our colleges and universities are going to be on an online environment, and hopefully that means that those are going to be prime locations that we can take advantage of and use going forward.
Yeah. And Dean, I know that we've gotten a couple of questions around the expansion of vote by mail and the governor's executive order. The Board of Supervisors adopted this vote center model, so every voter will get a vote by mail. And so why are you still doing in-person voting? I know it's something that our organization and our partners do believe in, but I think it's important for people to understand the why.
Yeah, so I think there are a number of reasons. One is, and I feel very strongly about this. I think that we're in an environment where relying on a single mode of voting is just it's too high risk. I mean, we're hearing daily. I mean, all of the same things that government and private industry are dealing with in this pandemic environment. Have a subset impact on elections. So you're hearing about the economic issues with the Postal Service, the changes in leadership at the Postal Service. And I don't share that to scare anybody, because I do have confidence that the Postal Service will be a good partner and will help ensure that these vote-by-mail ballots serve as the fail-safe method that they need to in this environment. But I don't think we can put all of our eggs in that basket. We know just from the data that there are locations and there are populations in Los Angeles County that are unlikely to receive their mail, or who just don't have confidence in that. We know that from an accessibility standpoint, even though we have remote accessible vote-by-mail services that allow a voter with a disability to use a vote-by-mail ballot, we know that there are other conditions or situations where the accessible voting location in person is just a better voting experience for those voters, and we need to meet that. We know in this county, with 13 required languages and a number of additional languages that aren't even required, that inevitably there are going to be voters who didn't know or didn't request a ballot in their preferred language, who are going to be better served by going to an in-person vote center where they can use a ballot marking device that allows them to listen to the ballot in a preferred language and to view it in a preferred language. So those are our prime examples. I think the other thing that I would just point back to again is the data. We know that 450,000 of the voters who showed up and voted in person in March were mailed a vote-by-mail ballot. So that is an indication that there's a preference on the part of voters. Now, will that be different based on the pandemic conditions? I don't know. You know, there isn't data to show how elections work in a pandemic, but I don't think we should superimpose our assumption that voters are not going to show up. We know, again, in these smaller elections, there have still been voters who showed up and voted in person. The conditional voter registration law, which is of high interest in California to ensure that nobody is left without the opportunity to register and participate in the election, that depends on in-person voting options. Because if you're not registered, you're not going to get that vote-by-mail ballot. So we have to ensure that access still exists.
Great, thank you, Dean. And just one question to close us out. And again, thank you for joining us. We know your schedule's tight. We had 30 plus questions come in, so we'll make sure to get those to your office to make sure that folks get answers to them. So just to close this up, I know that there is interest from partners to support your office, either helping to identify vote centers, to help recruit election workers. What's the best way for people to connect with your office directly?
Sure, no, and we welcome that participation in that partnership. I think that the best way is probably to do that through existing networks. So if your organization is already connected with the VCA LA group or with the future California elections, that's a good way. I know Astrid, I can guarantee you that Astrid will share that information with us, and we'll continue to partner through that. But simply contacting me, I can put you in touch with our Government and Legislative Affairs Division that monitors our outreach and education programs. And I would really say, think broadly about this and think creatively. What is the part of this where you or your organization can best contribute or can best inform us of information that we need to be successful in November. So yes, it's vote center recruitment. Yes, it's election center or voting center recruitment and selection, but it's also things about letting us know where there are people participating today who are much more knowledgeable about where those pockets are in our community, where there are those trust gaps, or where there are those unique situations where we have pockets of people who might have a particular language need, or who understand the intricacies of how public transit works for voters with accessibility needs. That's the kind of information and data that we need, and we need that early to ensure that we plan ahead for that.
Thanks again, Dean, for taking time to join us today. We look forward to our continued partnership, and we will be posting the recording online as well, make it available to folks at the end. So appreciate your time.
Thank you. And thank you and Mindy again for reaching out right away and helping to put this together, and for persevering through the conditions. I mean, it's amazing that you're able to put this together and we can have this many people participating. That bodes well for where we're heading towards November. So thank you.
Yeah, we all have the shared goal right now. So thank you so much. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn off our videos, and we'll pass it over to Mindy to continue the program.